Sarah Chen sat alone at the corner table in the military dining hall, picking at her salad while reading a book. She wore simple civilian clothes, jeans and a plain gray sweater. Her long black hair was tied back in a messy bun and she had no makeup on. To anyone watching, she looked like just another young woman, maybe a contractor or visitor on the base. The dining hall was buzzing with the usual evening crowd. Soldiers in uniform filled most tables, their conversations mixing with the clatter of trays and utensils. Sarah preferred eating late when it was less crowded, but tonight seemed busier than usual. She had been on base for 3 days now, staying in the guest quarters while waiting for her next assignment. Most people assumed she was civilian support staff or maybe a family member visiting someone. Sarah never corrected them. She had learned long ago that sometimes it was easier to blend in than to explain who she really was. At 28, Sarah had been in the Navy for 10 years. She joined right after high school, determined to prove herself in a world that often underestimated her. Standing just 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 125 pounds, she had heard every joke about her size. But Sarah had something that couldn't be measured in height or weight, an unbreakable will and razor-sharp instincts. Her journey to becoming a Navy SEAL had been brutal. The training pushed every candidate to their absolute limit, and most didn't make it. Sarah remembered the first day when the instructor looked at her and shook his head. "You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart?" he had asked. Sarah just smiled and said she was exactly where she belonged. The training lasted months. Every day brought new challenges designed to break the weak and forge the strong. Swimming in freezing water until her lips turned blue, carrying heavy packs for miles through mud and sand, learning to fight, shoot, and think strategically under extreme pressure. Many nights Sarah fell into her bunk so exhausted she could barely move, but she never quit. When other candidates rang the bell to signal their surrender, Sarah kept going. When injuries slowed her down, she found ways to adapt. When instructors pushed harder, she pushed back even harder. She had something to prove, not just to them, but to herself. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the constant doubt from others. Fellow candidates would whisper that she only made it this far because the Navy needed to look progressive. Some instructors seemed to give her extra attention, looking for any excuse to wash her out. Sarah learned to ignore the noise and focus on her performance. Her specialty became underwater operations. Sarah could hold her breath longer than most of her male counterparts. She moved through water like she was born for it. Her small size, which many saw as a weakness, became her greatest advantage in tight spaces and stealth operations. After graduation, Sarah's first few missions were in the Middle East. She proved herself quickly, earning respect from her team through actions rather than words. She saved lives, completed impossible objectives, and never let her team down. Slowly, the doubts faded. Her teammates began to see her not as the small woman who somehow made it through training, but as one of the most reliable operators they had ever worked with. Now, sitting in this dining hall, Sarah reflected on how far she had come. Tomorrow she would fly out for another classified mission. Tonight was her last chance to relax and enjoy a quiet meal. She turned a page in her book, completely absorbed in the story. It was a thriller about a detective solving a murder case. Sarah always loved mysteries and puzzles. Maybe that's why she was so good at her job. Every mission was like solving a complex puzzle where lives hung in the balance. The noise level in the dining hall suddenly increased. Sarah glanced up to see a group of young recruits walking in. They looked fresh out of basic training, their uniforms perfectly pressed, their haircuts still sharp. They carried themselves with the confidence that came from completing their initial military training. But Sarah could see they still had a lot to learn. The 6 recruits grabbed trays and went through the food line, joking and laughing loudly. Sarah watched them for a moment, remembering her own early days in the military. She had been just as eager and confident back then, thinking she knew everything there was to know about military life. One of the recruits, a tall blonde guy who seemed to be their unofficial leader, was telling a story about their training exercise that morning. His voice carried across the dining hall as he described how he had outperformed everyone else. The others laughed and encouraged him, clearly enjoying his version of events. Sarah smiled to herself and returned to her book. Young soldiers were the same everywhere, full of energy and eager to prove themselves. She remembered being exactly like them, convinced that basic training had prepared her for anything the military could throw at her. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, These 6 recruits would learn a lesson about assumptions that they would never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you least expect. The 6 recruits finished getting their food and looked around the dining hall for a place to sit. Most tables were occupied, and the few empty ones were scattered around the room. The tall blonde recruit, whose name was Jake, spotted Sarah sitting alone at her corner table. "Hey guys, look over there," Jake said, nodding toward Sarah. "That table's got plenty of room." He grinned at his friends. "And the company doesn't look bad either." The other recruits followed his gaze. Sarah was still reading her book, completely unaware of their attention. In the fluorescent lighting of the dining hall, she looked even younger than her 28 years. Her simple clothes and casual appearance made her seem completely out of place among all the uniformed personnel. "Think she's someone's girlfriend visiting?" asked Marcus, a stocky recruit from Texas with a thick accent. "Maybe she's lost," laughed Derek, the shortest of the group but trying hardest to fit in. "Probably looking for the civilian cafeteria." Jake picked up his tray and started walking toward Sarah's table. "Only one way to find out. Come on, let's go introduce ourselves." The other 5 recruits followed, their boots clicking against the linoleum floor. As they approached, Sarah sensed their presence but didn't look up from her book. She had learned to read people through peripheral vision and body language. These young soldiers were walking with the swagger that came from recent graduation and too much confidence. Jake reached the table first and set his tray down without asking. "Mind if we join you?" he said, though he was already pulling out a chair. "I'm Jake, and these are my buddies. We just finished advanced infantry training." Sarah looked up slowly, marking her place in the book with her finger. She gave them a polite smile. "Of course, please sit down. I'm Sarah." The recruits settled around the table, their energy filling the previously quiet space. They immediately began talking among themselves, occasionally including Sarah in the conversation with questions that revealed their assumptions about her. "So, Sarah, what brings you to the base?" asked Tony, a recruit from New York who considered himself smooth with women. "Are you visiting someone special?" "You could say that," Sarah replied vaguely, taking a sip of her water. Marcus leaned forward. "You don't look military. Are you a contractor or something? Maybe working in administration?" Sarah shrugged. "I work for the Navy." This answer seemed to satisfy them, confirming their assumption that she was some kind of civilian employee. Jake, feeling more confident now, decided to impress her with stories from their training. "You should have seen us today," he said, puffing out his chest. "We had this combat simulation, and I basically carried the whole team." The instructors said it was some of the best tactical thinking they'd seen from new recruits. The others nodded enthusiastically, each adding their own embellishments to the story. Sarah listened politely, occasionally making appropriate sounds of interest. She had heard similar stories countless times from young soldiers eager to prove themselves. "The thing is," Derek chimed in, "most people don't really understand what military training is like. It's not like in the movies. It's real hardcore stuff that pushes you to your absolute limits." "Yeah," agreed Tony. "I bet most civilians would wash out in the first week. No offense, Sarah, but military life isn't for everyone. It takes a special kind of person to handle the pressure." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine it does take special qualities to succeed in military training." Her calm response encouraged them to continue. They began describing various aspects of their training: the physical challenges, the weapons training, the tactical exercises. Each recruit tried to top the others with more impressive stories about their own performance. Marcus started telling a particularly detailed story about a night navigation exercise. It was pitch black, and we had to find our way through hostile territory using only a compass and map. Most people would have been completely lost, but I've always had great natural instincts for that kind of thing. "That sounds challenging," Sarah said. "Navigation can be tricky, especially under pressure." "Exactly." Marcus beamed, pleased that she understood. "That's what separates the real soldiers from the wannabes. When things get tough, you find out who can handle it and who can't." Jake decided to take the conversation in a different direction. "You know, Sarah, if you're interested in learning more about military life, maybe we could show you around sometime. There's a lot more to this base than most civilians ever get to see." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement from the others. They clearly saw this as an opportunity to impress her further, and maybe even ask her out on a date. "That's very kind of you," Sarah said diplomatically, "but I think I know my way around pretty well." Come on, pressed Derek. How well could you really know a military base? Unless you've been through actual training, you don't really understand how everything works. The recruits were enjoying themselves, feeling important and impressive as they educated this young civilian woman about military life. They had no idea that Sarah had forgotten more about military operations than they had ever learned. Sarah glanced at her watch. She had planned to finish her meal and return to her quarters early, but these young men seemed determined to continue their impromptu orientation session. She decided to let them talk a little longer. Sometimes it was educational to listen to fresh perspectives, even from inexperienced sources. Besides, she was curious to see how far their assumptions would take them. In just a few minutes, their education was about to take an unexpected turn. The conversation continued with the recruits becoming increasingly animated in their descriptions of military life. They spoke about weapons training, tactical maneuvers, and survival skills as if they were the first people to ever master these concepts. Sarah continued eating her salad, occasionally asking simple questions that encouraged them to elaborate further. The hardest part about military training, Jake explained, leaning back in his chair with authority, is learning to think strategically under pressure. You have to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death for your whole team. That must require a lot of mental toughness, Sarah observed. Exactly, Tony jumped in. That's why not everyone can cut it. You need physical strength, sure, but the mental game is what really separates the elite from the average soldiers. Derek nodded vigorously. Like yesterday, we had this hostage rescue simulation. Most people would have panicked, but we kept our cool and executed a perfect extraction. The instructors said we showed real leadership potential. Sarah noticed how each recruit seemed to position himself as the star of every story. It was typical of young soldiers fresh out of training. They all believed they were destined for greatness in special operations. Have any of you considered applying for specialized units? Sarah asked innocently. The question lit up their faces. This was clearly a topic they had discussed many times among themselves. Actually, yeah, Marcus said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. A few of us are thinking about trying out for elite units, maybe Rangers or even Special Forces. The thing is, Jake added, those units only take the absolute best. They put you through tests that would break most people. But I think we've got what it takes. Tony leaned forward eagerly. I've been reading about Navy SEALs. Now that's the ultimate test. They say the training is so brutal that most people quit in the first few weeks. Only the toughest of the tough can handle that kind of pressure. Yeah, I read that too, Derek said. They make you do these crazy underwater exercises where you have to hold your breath for like 2 minutes while someone tries to drown you. And that's just the beginning. Sarah raised an eyebrow. That does sound intense. Oh, it gets worse, Marcus continued. They wake you up in the middle of the night and make you carry heavy boats on your head while running on the beach. Then they dump you in freezing ocean water for hours. Most people can't handle that kind of punishment. The recruits were clearly fascinated by the mystique of special operations. They spoke about elite units with a mixture of awe and determination, as if they were discussing mythical challenges that only legendary warriors could overcome. The thing about SEALs, Jake said with the confidence of someone who had never actually met one, is that they're basically superhuman. They can swim for miles underwater, fight multiple enemies at once, and survive in any environment. They're like real-life action heroes. Plus, they get all the coolest missions, Tony added. While regular soldiers are doing boring guard duty, SEALs are out there saving the world and taking down terrorists. Sarah smiled at their enthusiasm. You all seem to know quite a bit about special operations. We've done our research, Derek said proudly. If you want to join the elite, you need to understand what you're getting into. Most people have no idea how demanding that kind of training really is. I bet if a SEAL walked in here right now, Marcus laughed, we wouldn't even recognize them. They probably look like normal people when they're not on missions. That's true, Jake agreed. They're trained to blend in and look ordinary, but you can usually tell by the way they carry themselves. There's something different about people who've been through that kind of training. The recruits all looked around the dining hall, as if trying to spot any hidden special operations personnel among the regular soldiers. Their eyes passed right over Sarah without a second thought. You know what I heard? Tony said, leaning in closer. I heard that female SEALs are even tougher than the men because they have to work twice as hard to prove themselves. But there's probably only like 5 of them in the whole Navy. Makes sense, Derek nodded. That kind of training would be brutal for anyone, but especially for women. No offense, Sarah, but most women just don't have the physical capability for that level of combat training. None taken, Sarah replied calmly. Jake checked his watch and realized they had been talking for almost 30 minutes. Hey, we should probably head out soon. We've got early PT tomorrow morning. Yeah, our drill instructor likes to wake us up at 5 a.m. for surprise inspections. Marcus groaned. He's always looking for ways to test our readiness and discipline. Sounds like he keeps you on your toes, Sarah said. That's the military for you, Tony explained. You never know when something might happen that requires immediate action. That's why we train so hard, so we're always ready to respond to any situation. Derek stood up and started gathering his empty tray. It was really nice meeting you, Sarah. Maybe we'll see you around the base sometime. The others began following suit, preparing to leave. But Jake had one more story he wanted to tell. Before we go, he said, settling back into his chair, let me tell you about this one exercise we did last week. It was supposed to test our ability to identify potential threats in civilian settings. The other recruits sat back down, eager to hear Jake's latest tale. Sarah glanced at her watch again. This conversation was about to take an interesting turn, though none of them realized it yet. Sometimes the best lessons come when you least expect them. Jake settled back into his chair with the confidence of someone about to deliver his best story yet. The other recruits gave him their full attention, and Sarah continued to listen politely while finishing the last of her salad. So last week, Jake began, our instructor set up this really complex scenario. He told us we were in a situation where enemy agents might be disguised as civilians, and we had to learn how to identify potential threats without being obvious about it. That sounds like important training, Sarah said, genuinely interested in how they had been taught threat assessment. Oh, it was incredibly detailed, Marcus jumped in. They taught us all these techniques for reading body language and spotting people who don't belong. Derek leaned forward eagerly. Yeah, like how someone with military training stands differently than regular civilians. They have better posture and more awareness of their surroundings. Exactly, Jake continued, and the way they move is different too. Trained personnel scan rooms automatically when they enter, checking for exits and potential threats. Regular people just walk in and sit down without thinking about tactical positioning. Tony nodded enthusiastically. They also taught us about concealed weapons indicators, like how someone carrying a hidden gun might adjust their clothing differently or avoid certain movements that could reveal what they're hiding. Sarah found their enthusiasm amusing but also concerning. These young soldiers had clearly learned some basics, but they seemed to think a few classroom lessons made them experts in threat detection. Those are useful skills to develop, she said diplomatically. The best part, Jake continued, was when they brought in this undercover instructor to test us. He was dressed like a janitor and spent the whole day on base doing maintenance work. We were supposed to figure out that he wasn't really a janitor. How were you supposed to tell? Sarah asked. Well, first of all, his hands were too clean for someone who supposedly worked with tools all day, Derek explained proudly, and he was way too aware of his surroundings. Real janitors don't constantly scan rooms like they're looking for threats, Marcus added. Plus, he was in too good shape. His posture was perfect, and he moved with the kind of precision you only get from military training. Sounds like you all picked up on the clues, Sarah observed. We did pretty well, Jake said modestly, though his tone suggested he thought they had done exceptionally well. The instructor said we showed good instincts for that kind of analysis. Tony looked directly at Sarah. Actually, you could probably benefit from learning some of these techniques. I mean, as a civilian working on a military base, you never know when you might encounter something suspicious. That's thoughtful of you to be concerned about my safety, Sarah replied with a straight face. It's not just about safety, Derek explained earnestly. It's about being aware of your environment and understanding the people around you. Most civilians go through life completely oblivious to potential dangers. Jake warmed to the topic. Like right now, for instance. If a real threat walked into this dining hall, most people wouldn't notice until it was too late. But with proper training, you learn to spot the warning signs immediately. What kind of warning signs should I look for? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about what they had been taught. Well, Marcus said, glancing around the dining hall as if conducting a demonstration, someone who's been through serious military training carries themselves differently. They're more alert, more controlled in their movements. They also tend to choose seats that give them good sight lines and easy access to exits, Tony added, clearly proud of his knowledge. Derek jumped in with his own contribution. And if they're really elite, like special forces or something, they might actually work hard to look ordinary. But there are always tells that give them away if you know what to look for. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying that even when special operations personnel try to blend in, trained observers can still identify them? Absolutely, Jake said confidently. It's like our instructor always says. You can take the soldier out of the uniform, but you can't take the training out of the soldier. That's an interesting way to put it, Sarah said. Marcus looked around the dining hall again. I bet if there was a Navy SEAL sitting in here right now, we could probably spot them. The training changes how you move, how you think, how you position yourself. You really think so? Sarah asked with mild curiosity. Definitely, Derek said firmly. Someone who's been through SEAL training would stand out to anyone who knows what to look for. They can't completely hide that level of conditioning and awareness. Tony was getting excited about the theoretical exercise. Yeah, and think about it. A real SEAL would probably choose a table where they could watch the whole room. They'd sit with their back to a wall so nobody could sneak up on them. Jake nodded sagely. And they'd definitely notice us before we noticed them. That kind of training makes you constantly aware of everyone around you. Plus, Marcus added, they'd probably assess us as potential threats within seconds of us sitting down. That's just how their minds work after going through that kind of program. Sarah glanced around the dining hall, then back at the recruits. So you think someone with that level of training would automatically be suspicious of 6 young soldiers approaching their table? Oh, for sure, Derek said. Elite personnel are trained to be paranoid. It keeps them alive in dangerous situations. The recruits were clearly enjoying this theoretical discussion about threat assessment and elite military training. They had no idea they were sitting across from someone who had actually lived through everything they were describing. Jake checked his watch again. All right, we really should get going. But this has been a great conversation, Sarah. Maybe next time we see you, we can tell you more about military life. I'd like that, Sarah said with a small smile. As the recruits began to stand up again, preparing to finally leave, none of them realized that their theoretical exercise was about to become very real. Their education in threat assessment was about to receive a practical demonstration they would never forget. As the recruits gathered their trays and prepared to leave, Jake suddenly stopped and snapped his fingers. Wait, I just remembered something else from our training that Sarah might find interesting. The others paused, trays in hand, curious about what Jake wanted, to add to their already lengthy conversation about military expertise. Our instructor told us this story about a female Navy SEAL who was involved in some classified mission. Overseas, Jake said, clearly relishing the opportunity to share another impressive military tale. Sarah raised an eyebrow but remained silent, curious to hear this second-hand account. Apparently, Jake continued, she was working undercover in some hostile territory, and she had to maintain her cover while surrounded by enemy combatants. The instructor said it was one of the most dangerous situations any SEAL had ever been in. Tony set his tray back down, intrigued. What happened? Well, according to the story, she kept her cool and maintained her cover identity perfectly. Even when the enemy started getting suspicious and testing her, she never broke character. Derek leaned forward. How did she get out of the situation? That's the amazing part, Jake said dramatically. When things finally went bad, she took out 6 armed enemies in less than 60 seconds using just hand-to-hand combat. The instructor said it was like something out of an action movie. Marcus whistled appreciatively. 6 enemies? That's incredible. Yeah, but here's the thing, Jake continued. The instructor said the key to her success was that none of the enemies saw her as a threat until it was too late. They completely underestimated her because she looked like a harmless civilian woman. Sarah took a sip of her water, her expression remaining neutral. That's quite a story. The point is, Tony said earnestly, appearances can be deceiving. Someone who looks completely ordinary might actually be the most dangerous person in the room. Very true, Sarah agreed quietly. Derek suddenly had a thought. You know what's funny? That story kind of reminds me of this situation. I mean, here we are, 6 trained soldiers, sitting with someone we assumed was just a regular civilian. The recruits all laughed at the comparison, finding it amusing to imagine mild-mannered Sarah as some kind of secret agent. Could you imagine? Marcus chuckled. What if Sarah here was actually some kind of undercover special ops person just sitting here listening to us explain military life to her. That would be hilarious, Jake laughed. We've been telling her all about military training and she's been sitting there pretending not to know anything about it. Sarah smiled at their laughter. That would be quite ironic. The funniest part, Derek added, would be if she was actually more qualified than all of us combined. And we've been lecturing her about basic military concepts. Tony was grinning widely at the absurd scenario. Yeah, like what if she was actually a Navy SEAL herself, and we've been explaining to her what Navy SEALs do. The recruits found this hypothetical situation extremely amusing. The idea that the quiet young woman they had been educating about military life could actually be an elite special operations warrior struck them as the height of comedy. Well, Marcus said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, I guess we'd look pretty foolish if that were true. Incredibly foolish, Jake agreed, still chuckling. Can you imagine sitting here for 45 minutes explaining military training to someone who actually went through the most elite training in the world? Sarah set down her water glass and looked thoughtfully at each of the recruits. They were all still smiling at their shared joke, completely unaware that their hypothetical scenario was about to become reality. You know, Sarah said calmly, that would be quite embarrassing for you. Something in her tone made Jake look at her more carefully. For the first time since they had sat down, he really studied her face instead of just glancing at her casually. But fortunately, Derek said, still oblivious, there's no chance of that actually being true. Right, Sarah? Sarah leaned back in her chair and smiled at them with genuine warmth. Well, that depends on how you define chance. The laughter began to fade as the recruit started to pick up on something different in Sarah's demeanor. She was still sitting casually, still speaking in the same quiet voice, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. What do you mean? Tony asked, his smile becoming uncertain. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. She placed it on the table in front of them and flipped it open, revealing her military identification card. The recruits leaned forward to read the information, and their expressions changed dramatically as they processed what they were seeing. The ID card clearly displayed Sarah's name, her photograph, and most importantly, her rank and classification. Petty Officer First Class, Naval Special Warfare Command. No way, Derek whispered, his face turning pale. Sarah closed the wallet and put it back in her pocket. I'm afraid your hypothetical scenario just became very real. The dining hall suddenly seemed much quieter as the 6 recruits stared at her in stunned silence. Everything they had said over the past 45 minutes was now playing back in their minds with completely different context. Jake was the first to find his voice. You're actually a Navy SEAL, Sarah confirmed matter-of-factly. And I have to say, your assessment of threat identification skills needs some work. The recruits looked at each other, then back at Sarah, trying to process the magnitude of their mistake. The woman they had been condescendingly educating about military life was exactly the kind of elite warrior they had been discussing with such admiration. The next 60 seconds would teach them more about assumptions and respect than any classroom lesson ever could. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. The 6 recruits sat frozen, their minds racing to reprocess every word they had spoken during the past 45 minutes. The confident young soldiers who had been lecturing about military life suddenly looked like children caught in an embarrassing mistake. Jake was the first to attempt damage control. Ma'am, we had no idea. We didn't mean any disrespect. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the swagger completely gone. Sarah held up a gentle hand. Relax, you weren't disrespectful. Misguided, perhaps, but not disrespectful. Derek's face was bright red. We feel like complete idiots. You shouldn't, Sarah said calmly. You made assumptions based on limited information. It happens to everyone, even experienced personnel. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. We literally spent 45 minutes explaining military training to a Navy SEAL. And telling me about threat assessment, Sarah added with a small smile. That part was particularly educational. Tony looked mortified. When we said most civilians couldn't handle military training, you weren't wrong, Sarah interrupted. Most civilians can't, but I stopped being a civilian 10 years ago. The recruits exchanged glances, each remembering their own specific contributions to the conversation. The memory of their confident explanations about special operations was now painfully embarrassing. Ma'am, Jake said carefully, when we were talking about how to identify Special Forces personnel, you had some of the basics right, Sarah acknowledged. Posture, awareness, tactical positioning. But you missed the most important lesson. Which is? Derek asked quietly. Sarah leaned forward slightly. The best operators are the ones you never suspect. If someone looks obviously military when they're trying to blend in, they're not very good at their job. The recruits nodded, beginning to understand the deeper lesson she was teaching them. You said earlier that elite personnel can't completely hide their training, Marcus recalled. That's true to some extent, Sarah agreed. But good operators learn to control those tells when necessary. I chose this table because it has good sightlines and wall coverage. I assessed each of you when you approached, but I also knew how to appear completely unremarkable. Tony looked confused. But you seemed so normal. I am normal, Sarah said with amusement. That's the point. Special operations personnel aren't superhumans from action movies. We're regular people who happen to have specialized training. Jake was struggling with a realization. You knew exactly what we were doing from the moment we sat down. Of course I did. 6 young soldiers approaching a lone woman at her table. I evaluated the situation immediately and determined you weren't a threat. How could you tell? Derek asked, genuinely curious now. Body language, confidence level, age, and behavior patterns. You were clearly new recruits eager to impress rather than experienced personnel with hostile intent. Sarah's explanation was delivered without condescension, more like a teacher helping students understand a concept they had missed. When we started talking about special operations, Marcus said slowly, you could have said something. I could have, Sarah agreed. But I was curious to see what you had learned and how you thought about these topics. Sometimes listening teaches you more than talking. The recruits were beginning to relax slightly, realizing that Sarah wasn't angry with them despite their obvious embarrassment. Ma'am, Tony said hesitantly, can I ask how long you've been a SEAL? 5 years since I completed training. 10 years total in the Navy. Derek looked amazed. And you've been on actual missions? Many missions. That's what we do. Jake gathered his courage for the question they were all thinking. Is it really like what we described? The training and everything? Sarah considered the question carefully. The training is every bit as challenging as you've heard, probably more so. But it's not about being superhuman. It's about mental toughness, teamwork, and never giving up. What was the hardest part? Marcus asked. Learning to control my ego, Sarah said without hesitation. Young soldiers often think they know more than they do. The training breaks that down and builds something better. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on any of them. Ma'am, Derek said quietly, we're really sorry for assuming. Don't apologize for assumptions, Sarah interrupted. Learn from them. Tonight you learned that dangerous people don't always look dangerous. That expertise doesn't always announce itself, and that respect should be earned through observation rather than given based on appearances. Jake nodded slowly. We thought we were so smart with our threat assessment training. You're learning. That's what matters. Real expertise comes from experience, not classroom exercises. Sarah stood up and gathered her tray. You all seem like good soldiers with potential. But remember, confidence without experience can be dangerous. Stay humble and keep learning. The recruits stood as well, their earlier swagger replaced by genuine respect and a healthy dose of humility. Ma'am, Jake said formally, thank you for the lesson. We won't forget it. I hope not, Sarah replied. And next time you're evaluating potential threats or trying to identify special operations personnel, remember that the most dangerous person in the room might be the one you least expect. As she walked toward the tray return, Marcus called after her. Ma'am, one more question if you don't mind. Sarah turned back to face them. How did you stay so calm while we were making fools of ourselves? Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. Because I remember being exactly where you are now. Young, eager, and absolutely certain I knew everything there was to know about military life. Experience taught me otherwise. She paused, looking at each of their faces. The fact that you can admit your mistakes and learn from them tells me you have what it takes to become real soldiers. Don't lose that willingness to learn. Tony shook his head in amazement. We're never going to live this down. You don't have to live it down, Sarah said. You just have to live with it and be better because of it. As Sarah walked away, the 6 recruits stood in stunned silence, watching the small woman in civilian clothes disappear into the crowd of uniformed personnel. She blended in seamlessly, just another person finishing dinner and heading back to their quarters. Derek was the first to speak.
Did that really just happen?
We just spent 45 minutes explaining Navy SEAL training to an actual Navy SEAL, Jake said, still processing the enormity of their mistake. Marcus sat back down heavily. And she was so nice about it. She could have humiliated us. She did humiliate us, Tony pointed out. She just did it gently. The recruits slowly gathered their trays and began walking toward the exit. Their conversation was much quieter now, filled with reflection rather than bravado. You know what the worst part is? Derek said as they walked. Everything we said about being able to identify Special Forces personnel. We were sitting right across from one and never had a clue. The worst part, Jake corrected, is that we were so busy trying to impress her that we didn't bother to actually observe her. We saw what we expected to see instead of what was really there. As they left the dining hall, each recruit was processing the lesson in his own way. They had learned more about military life, respect, and humility in the past hour than in weeks of formal training. Marcus paused at the door and looked back at the corner table where they had sat. I wonder how many other times we've completely misjudged someone. Hopefully this was the wake-up call we needed, Tony said quietly. The 6 young soldiers walked into the evening air, forever changed by their encounter with the unassuming woman who had taught them the most valuable lesson of their military careers. Never underestimate anyone, and never let assumptions cloud your judgment. Back in her quarters, Sarah sat at her desk writing in her mission journal. She smiled as she wrote about the evening's events. Teaching moments came in many forms, and sometimes the best lessons were the ones that happened naturally. Tomorrow she would deploy on another classified mission, using the same skills that had allowed her to remain completely invisible to 6 trained soldiers actively looking for people exactly like her. The URSU recruits would remember this night for the rest of their military careers, and hopefully, they would become better soldiers because of it. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with wisdom, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from true expertise. Sarah had won this engagement without throwing a single punch, proving once again that the mind is the most powerful weapon of all.